Good afternoon and thank you for joining us. Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, will deliver a brief statement ahead of this afternoon's Security Council session. He will take your questions afterwards. If you have a question, please remember to state your name and your media outlet. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. The IPC recently published a report filled with baseless and slanderous claims against the State of Israel. Its assessment, following previous ones which have all been proven incorrect, lacks credibility. They rely on biased, prejudiced sources to recycle outright lies rather than focusing on genuine, meaningful assistance. As I have said here in the past, there are agencies dedicated to real humanitarian work, and then there are those like the IPC which prioritize smearing Israel over actually helping those in need. The IPC's report, like its previous reports, is riddled with inaccuracies by its own figures. The situation in Gaza, including in northern Gaza, has shown improvement since October. Yet, instead of recognizing this, the IPC chooses to ignore facts, pushing a narrative detached from reality and hostile to the truth. In today's session in the Security Council, I will counter the IPC's claims point by point, exposing the inaccuracy of its claims by detailing Israel's extensive humanitarian efforts across all of Gaza. I urge the Security Council and the entire international community to focus on supporting agencies that truly work to ease suffering, rather than those invested in spreading harmful propaganda. We have released mountains of evidence on the anger that Gazan civilians feel toward Hamas and Hamas's torture of civilians. The Council must listen to the cries of the Gazan people themselves, cease their obsession with Israel, and focus their energy on eliminating the true oppressors of Gaza, Hamas terrorists. Thank you.
Ambassador, it's Kamala Fall from U.S. News and World Report. There's news in the last hour or so that the new U.S. ambassador to Israel will be Mike Huckabee. Do you know him? I think I've seen a picture or two of you with him. Do you think he will move forward on a path forward with the Trump administration? What's your sense of his work in Israel?
I want to congratulate my dear friend, Governor Mike Huckabee. I think he will be a great ambassador to Israel. He's very familiar with the facts on the ground. I think he visited Israel dozens of times. He had like a yearly visit to Israel, and I had the honor to escort him. Also, after October 7th, he came, and I took him to visit the sites on Kfar Aza, Be'eri, and other locations where the massacre took place. So we will welcome him, and we will be expecting his arrival.
Have you spoken with him?
Not yet, but I will speak with him today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Abbas. Comedian Intikhabi Fard, Independent Persian. Yesterday, Prince Mohammed bin Salman calls on Israel to respect Iran's sovereignty. And also, he said an absolute rejection on Israeli attack to Gaza and Lebanon. I would like to hear your comment of these challenges. Thank you.
Well, we respect our neighbors. We know that the aggression comes from Iran. They were the one who attacked Israel with hundreds of missiles. I would advise them not to try to take advantage of the transition period. From today until January 20th, you have more than 2 months. So maybe someone in Iran thinks that he can take advantage of that, and I would advise them not to do it. We have proven that they are vulnerable. We have proven that we can target any place in Iran we wish to do so. We are a peaceful nation, but if Iran will attack us, they will see more capabilities of the IDF.
Ambassador, today the UN spokesperson said that October has seen the least amount of aid getting into Gaza this year. What do you say?
So I will share with my colleagues in Security Council the numbers we have about the trucks that entered Gaza. We will show them that we are working harder to support the humanitarian need in Gaza. Today we opened another crossing, Kisufim, which is in the center of Gaza. This crossing was closed in 2005, and it was reopened today in order to allow more aid to enter Gaza.
As you try to stop UNRWA's operations, how do you plan to stop its right of refugees to return?
No, first of all, we haven't stopped UNRWA's operation. We decided about what we will do in Israel, and we decided that we will not cooperate with UNRWA in Israel, but we are not controlling the activities of UNRWA. I would expect the countries here to do exactly like the US, which decided to stop funding to UNRWA, to follow the US on this, and to divert funding to other NGOs who focus on real humanitarian aid and not fostering terrorism.
But if you're not going to cooperate with UNRWA, why would the other agencies want to donate to the entity if you're not going to cooperate and hurt their operations?
No, so I think we should work and others should donate to other NGOs, WHO, UNICEF, World Food Bank, that focus on humanitarian activities and not on promoting hatred against Israel and not paying terrorists. You know, tomorrow there will be a debate about UNRWA in the fourth committee, and I intend to come there. So I recommend that you will be there tomorrow morning. And here,
right of refugees to return?
I will allow other questions with your permission. Yes, please.
The State Department just announced that they won't be launching arms to Israel, given their satisfaction of the aid coming in. What's your response to that?
Well, I welcome the statement from the State Department. We work very closely with our allies in Washington, and as I stated earlier, we did a lot. We work very hard in order to assist the humanitarian needs in Gaza, and it's challenging, Ben, because on the other side you have Hamas. So even if we allow trucks to cross the checkpoints, Hamas will hijack the trucks, and sometimes even when we do 100%, we cannot guarantee the results. But I'm happy to see that there was progress, and I'm happy to hear that statement from the State Department. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The 9,781st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is protection of civilians in armed conflict. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel and Lebanon to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Ilse Blanda-Kielis, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, Mr. Lein Paulsen, Director, Office of Emergencies and Resilience, Food and Agriculture Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, and Ms. Joyce Msura, Acting Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Ilse Blanda-Kielis.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the humanitarian and human rights situation for Palestinian civilians across Gaza is catastrophic. According to figures verified by our office, close to 70% of those killed in Gaza by strikes, shelling, and other hostilities were children and women. The age group most represented in verified fatalities was children from 5 to 9 years old. According to the Ministry of Health of the State of Palestine, at least 43,000 people have been killed since the horrific attacks by Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups on Israel on the 7th of October last year. More than 100,000 people have been injured. These numbers are likely to be a serious understatement, as many of those killed and injured remain under the rubble. Nearly 1.9 million people have been displaced, many repeatedly, including pregnant women, people with disabilities, older people, and children. Israeli strikes on shelters and residential buildings continue to kill unconscionable numbers of civilians, women, men, young and old. Attacks on so-called safe zones prove that nowhere in Gaza is safe. Monitoring by our office indicates that this unprecedented level of killing and injury of civilians is a direct consequence of the parties' choice of methods and means of warfare and their failure to comply with fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. The pattern of strikes indicate that the Israeli Defense Forces have systematically violated fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attack. Palestinian armed groups have also conducted hostilities in ways that have likely contributed to harm to civilians. Israel's conduct of hostilities has destroyed Gaza's civilian infrastructure, including places that have protected status under international law, hospitals, schools, and vital services, including electricity, water, and sewage. This contributes directly to the famine risk being discussed today. Israel has killed hundreds of medical personnel, civilian police, journalists, and humanitarian aid workers, including more than 220 of our own United Nations staff. Thousands of Palestinians have been taken from Gaza to Israel, usually shackled and blindfolded to be held incommunicado. Meanwhile, there is constant and continued interference with the entry and distribution of humanitarian assistance, which has fallen to some of the lowest levels in a year. As the occupying power, Israel is obliged under international law to protect Palestinian civilians and to provide them with supplies essential to their survival. Yet, the cumulative impact of more than a year of destruction in Gaza has taken an enormous toll. Basic services for Palestinians in Gaza, the fabric of society, have been decimated. Conditions of life, particularly in northern Gaza, are increasingly not fit for survival. Mr. President, turning specifically to the situation in northern Gaza, the latest report from the respected and independent Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, warns there is a strong likelihood that famine is imminent. This horrific possibility cannot be separated from the unrelenting attacks on the human rights of civilians there. Over the past 5 weeks, the Israeli military has conducted strikes that have led to massive civilian fatalities in northern Gaza, particularly impacting women, children, older people, the sick, and people with disabilities, many of whom are reportedly trapped by Israeli military restrictions and attacks on escape routes. The pattern and the frequency of these reported attacks suggest the systematic targeting of locations known or which should have been known as sheltering significant numbers of civilians, coupled with the continued use of weapons with wide area effects in populated areas. We have warned repeatedly that this has led to disproportionate civilian fatalities. The Israeli military has also conducted repeated attacks on the 3 major hospitals in the area and on other vital infrastructure, while unlawfully restricting the entry and distribution of humanitarian assistance to northern Gaza. Already, OHCHR has documented how by April of this year, the severe restrictions imposed by Israel on the entry and distribution of goods and services necessary for the survival of the civilian population brought the risk of famine and starvation to Gaza. We again recall that the use of starvation of the civilian population as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. Just recently, the High Commissioner for Human Rights presented a detailed analysis of violations between November 2023 and April 2024. The report's conclusions call for a reckoning with the serious allegations of violations of international law. The manner in which the Israeli military is conducting operations in northern Gaza suggests not only that Israel's actions are seeking to empty northern Gaza of Palestinians by displacing survivors to the south, but points to further grave risks of atrocities of the most serious nature. Palestinian armed groups must also comply with international humanitarian law, including refraining from deliberately co-locating military objectives with civilians and civilian infrastructure, and must take all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population under their control from the effects of attacks. But failure by Palestinian armed groups to comply with international humanitarian law does not remove or reduce the obligation of Israeli forces to comply. Mr. President, all states consistent with their obligations under international law must therefore assess arms sales or transfers and provisions of military, logistical, or financial support to a party to the conflict, with a view to ending such support if this risks serious violations of international law. As the High Commissioner has repeatedly said, the violence must stop immediately. The hostages and those arbitrarily detained must be released. We must rush humanitarian aid into Gaza by all routes and restore essential services immediately. And there must be accountability, due reckoning with respect to the allegations of serious violations of international law through credible and impartial judicial authorities. The risks are very real and very immediate. The IPC has called for action in days, not weeks. We call on this Council to take all steps within its powers under the Charter to influence the parties to end violations, facilitate impartial humanitarian access, and protect civilians. This horrific war must end. In line with the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion and General Assembly Resolution ES 10/24, Israel must end its continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, allowing the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination. The only sustainable solution to this conflict is by forging a path that gives Palestinians and Israelis the chance to live side by side in peace, equality, and dignity. Thank you.
Thank Ms. Brans-Keres for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Lane Paulson.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Mr. President, Excellencies, the food security situation in northern Gaza is dire, and the latest indications are deeply troubling. Already in October, nearly 133,000 people faced catastrophic food insecurity, and the integrated food security phase classification released on 17th of October warned that under a reasonable worst-case scenario, a risk of famine existed for the whole of the Gaza Strip between November 2024 and April 2025. It also projected the population classified in IPC Phase 5, that is catastrophe, would nearly triple in the coming months. As emphasized by ASG Keres, there is nothing reasonable in what has unfolded in recent weeks. The conflict has intensified, and so has the damage to objects indispensable to civilian survival. Last Friday, the Independent Famine Review Committee issued an alert following significant developments since the conclusion of the last IPC analysis. The Famine Review Committee has found a strong likelihood that famine is occurring or imminent in areas within the northern Gaza Strip. Men, women, boys, and girls are effectively starving as the conflict rages, with humanitarian organizations blocked from delivering assistance to those in need. Excellencies, agri-food systems have collapsed in the Gaza Strip. Local food production has been decimated. Recent geospatial analyses indicate that nearly 70% of the cropland, which has contributed up to 1/3 of daily consumption, has been damaged or destroyed since the escalation in hostilities started last year. Likewise, animal production has been devastated, with almost 95% of cattle and more than half of sheep and goat herds now dead. These animal losses have both removed access to critical and nutritious sources of protein and milk, as well as devastated people's livelihoods. The satellite images from recent geospatial assessments indicate that heavy vehicle tracks, razing, shelling, and other conflict-related pressures have damaged large areas of farmland, infrastructure, wells, and other productive infrastructure for agricultural activities in the Gaza Strip. Khan Yunis has the largest and most impacted cultivated area in terms of surface area, while North Gaza has the highest proportion of damage per governorate. It is important to highlight that prior to the 7th of October 2023, Gaza was largely self-sufficient in vegetables, eggs, fresh milk, poultry, and fish. Local agriculture also produced much of the red meat and fresh fruits consumed inside Gaza. Domestic production of these fresh, nutritious, but perishable foods meant that Gazan children's nutritional outcomes were similar to those of children in middle-income countries, despite high levels of food insecurity. Local agriculture is first and foremost crucial for providing balanced nutrition for the entire population. It is also a source of income and provides a dignified life for those working in the agricultural and food production sector. A functioning local agri-food system is crucial to minimize the concerning levels of acute food insecurity and malnutrition across the Gaza Strip. The significant levels of damage to agri-food systems are exacerbating the humanitarian and hunger crisis on the ground and increasing the risk of famine. Food supply across the entire Gaza Strip has sharply deteriorated, while food availability is at an all-time low. Excellencies, when people cannot produce or access food, they will suffer increasingly extreme levels of acute malnutrition. People in Gaza have been experiencing this for more than a year. This is the 5th time that the Famine Review Committee has met in 1 year, a first in the history of the IPC classification, on the situation in the Gaza Strip. We can and must save lives. This is a humanitarian imperative, and it is our moral responsibility. People urgently need food, water, medical aid, and other essential humanitarian assistance. By the time famine has been declared, people are already dying of hunger, with irreversible consequences that can last generations. The window of opportunity to deliver this assistance is now, today, not tomorrow. Alongside food assistance, agricultural aid is vitally needed to restore availability of highly nutritious food, prevent the sector's total collapse, preserve remaining agricultural livelihoods, and curb acute hunger and malnutrition. Gaza's farmers, fishers, and livestock owners are risking their lives to continue production. But this is becoming impossible due to the restrictions and bans on imports of food production inputs and the substantial damages suffered by production infrastructure. FAO is ready to further scale up its efforts to respond to and mitigate famine and prevent its spread in the Gaza Strip through additional support for remaining livestock and to enable local food production where possible. Today, we renew the call for urgent diplomatic efforts from across the international community to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including famine in the Gaza Strip, and for Council members to remind all parties to the conflict of their responsibility to protect civilian infrastructure critical to the delivery of humanitarian aid and to ensure the proper functioning of agri-food systems and markets in situations of armed conflict, in respect to adhering to obligations under international humanitarian law. Immediate and unlimited safe access to people who are in need is indispensable to save lives and prevent famine. A ceasefire is urgently needed. We cannot forget that peace is a prerequisite for food security, and the right to food is a fundamental human right. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Paulson for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Joyce Misua.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the catastrophic situation in Gaza. Thank you also to our colleagues from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Food and Agriculture Organization. We unequivocally share the serious concerns they have expressed today. Since the escalation of this conflict in October 2023, we have briefed this Council on no fewer than 16 occasions. We have condemned the death, destruction, and dehumanization of civilians in Gaza who have been driven from their homes, stripped of their sense of place and dignity, forced to witness their family members killed, burned, and buried alive. Injured children have had the words, "wounded child," "no surviving family," penned on their arms. Most of Gaza is now a wasteland of rubble. What distinction was made and what precautions were taken if more than 70% of civilian housing is either damaged or destroyed? Essential commercial goods and services, including electricity, have been all but cut off. This has led to increasing hunger, starvation, and now, as we have heard, potentially famine. We are witnessing acts reminiscent of the gravest international crimes. Mr. President, the latest offensive that Israel started in North Gaza last month is an intensified, extreme, and accelerated version of the horrors of the past year. Shelters, homes, and schools have been burned and bombed to the ground. Numerous families remain trapped under rubble because fuel for digging equipment is being blocked by the Israeli authorities, and first responders have been blocked from reaching them. Ambulances have been destroyed and hospitals have come under attack. Supplies to the north are being cut off and people are being pushed farther south. The daily cruelty we see in Gaza seems to have no limits. Beit Hanun has been besieged for more than 1 month. Yesterday, food and water reached shelters, but today, Israeli soldiers forcibly displaced people from those same areas. People under siege now tell us they are afraid that they will be targeted if they receive help. As I brief you, Israeli authorities are blocking humanitarian assistance from entering North Gaza, where fighting continues and around 75,000 people remain with dwindling water and food supplies. Conditions of life across Gaza are unfit for human survival. Food is insufficient. Shelter items needed ahead of winter are in extremely short supply. Violent armed lootings of our convoys have become increasingly organized along routes from Kerem Shalom, driven by the collapse of public order and safety. Many food assistance kitchens have been forced to close. In October, daily food distribution shrunk by nearly 25% compared to September. These are not logistical problems. They can be solved with the right political will. The Israeli military's announcement that the Kisul film crossing into central Gaza has opened cannot come soon enough. However, our capacity to respond is being undermined, including by the Israeli Knesset legislation to ban UNRWA activities starting in January. If implemented, this bill will be another devastating blow to efforts to provide life-saving aid and avert the threat of famine. No other organization can fill these gaps. Mr. President, we also remain concerned about the deteriorating situation of Palestinians in the West Bank. Israeli forces continue to employ lethal tactics that appear to defy law enforcement standards, and they're causing damage to water and sewage networks and other infrastructure. The demolition of Palestinian-owned homes also continues. On 5th November, 9 homes were demolished in the Silwan area outside Jerusalem's Old City, displacing 42 people, nearly half of them children, to make way for an illegal settlement-related project. Israeli settlers continue attacks on Palestinians and their property, with more than 160 incidents related to the olive harvest documented in October alone, the majority resulting in casualties or property damage. Movement restrictions are making civilian access to essential services, particularly healthcare, increasingly challenging in refugee camps and in Area C, where humanitarian partners are scaling up to support communities in meeting needs. Mr. President, the most basic requirements of humanity are being disregarded. These are requirements that members of this Council, and indeed all member states, set out in international humanitarian and human rights law. They must be respected. Constant care must be taken to spare civilians throughout military operations. Civilians must be allowed to seek protection elsewhere, and they must be guaranteed their right to voluntarily return as international law demands. Reports indicating that people would not be allowed to return should be of grave concern to this Council. Parties must ensure that civilians' essential needs are met and must facilitate unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need, wherever they are. Hostages and those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately, and in the interim, they must be treated humanely and allowed visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Indiscriminate rocket fire towards Israel must stop. There must be accountability for international crimes. The provisional orders of the International Court of Justice in the case on the application of the Genocide Convention in the Gaza Strip and the determinations in its advisory opinion of July 2024 must be implemented now. Mr. President, now is the time for member states to use their leverage to prevent and stop violations of international humanitarian law through diplomatic and economic pressure, responsible arms transfer, and combating impunity. Now is the time for the Security Council to use its powers under the UN Charter to ensure compliance with international law and full implementation of its resolutions. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msua for her briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom. Thanks to ASG Brands Kellis and Acting USG Msua and Director Poulsen for their briefings. Colleagues, Gaza is in the grip of a humanitarian catastrophe with over 43,000 Palestinians killed, hospitals and roads destroyed, and winter approaching. We must see an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of all hostages. Ending the war is the best way to stop the suffering. The humanitarian situation is intolerable, and we need to act immediately to improve it. Aid deliveries last month were the lowest since the conflict began, and now imminent famine looms over northern Gaza, while food and other life-saving supplies are stuck at the border. This is appalling. It is completely unacceptable that trucks, humanitarian workers, and medics funded by the international community are unable to travel the last few miles to reach civilians. The Famine Review Committee has issued a shocking and urgent warning, one which Israel must heed and act on today. As the committee put it, it is abundantly clear that a worst-case scenario is now playing out in the areas of northern Gaza, where starvation, malnutrition, and deaths are believed to be rising fast. Colleagues, time has run out, and urgent solutions are required now to prevent the very worst from unfolding. There is no excuse for the Israeli government's ongoing restrictions on humanitarian assistance. They fly in the face of Israel's public commitments. So let me be clear. My government condemns these restrictions in the strongest terms. So we are calling on Israel to finally and immediately make good on its commitment to flood Gaza with aid. We want to see greater variety and quantity of essential items surging in, including food, water, fuel, and medicine. Israel must urgently enable safe and effective aid distribution. This includes repairing roads to deliver aid and enabling continuous access to northern Gaza from southern Gaza. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must be protected. Evacuation orders should be rescinded as soon as possible so families can return home. And humanitarians must be able to work safely and effectively. The United Nations and its agencies must be able to fulfill their mandate. UNRWA remains the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and provides essential basic services. The international community has been clear that Israel must not undermine its role and must meet all legal obligations as the occupying power. Colleagues, we cannot allow famine to take hold. There is no time to waste. The international community must now act as one and work with Israel to take every possible measure to prevent this disaster. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Keres, Acting Under Secretary General Masuya, and Director Paulson for the information provided. Mr. President, we meet today once more to discuss the horrific state of food insecurity in the Gaza Strip. Sadly, it is not because food is unavailable, but instead because there is deliberate action to prevent it from getting to civilians that are in dire need, a man-made catastrophe. Equally disturbing is the outlook for the next few months. I shudder to think what a mother tells her hungry child, who is even too weak to cry. Mr. President, the combination of an incessant bombing campaign, repeated displacement, and limited or no access to food, medicine, and water has created a firestorm of hunger, malnutrition, and disease. The recent statistics provided by the IPC and its Famine Review Committee provide the harrowing details of what innocent civilians, many of them hapless children and infants, are enduring in Gaza. The entire population is experiencing emergency levels of acute food insecurity. Should this conflict continue to intensify and expand, coupled with the non-entry of humanitarian goods and evacuation orders, there is a risk of famine for the entire Gaza Strip. In northern Gaza, several areas have been under siege since the beginning of October, and according to the FRC, famine is most likely imminent. All of this is man-made, Mr. President, and should spur this Council to immediate action to halt this systematic and calculated annihilation of innocent Palestinian civilians by starvation. Guyana listened carefully to the briefers today, and what we heard further reinforced the conclusion expressed on many other occasions that the apocalyptic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is entirely attributable to the persistent violation of international law, including international humanitarian law. This is evidenced by the non-compliance with the resolutions adopted by this Council, which all member states are duty-bound to comply with, and the order of provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice in January, March, and May. Guyana therefore reiterates its call to the government of Israel, the occupying power, whose responsibility it is to ensure the well-being of the Palestinian people, to immediately cease these violations of its legal obligations. Mr. President, in this context, Guyana has taken note of several extremely concerning trends that have been highlighted in the FRC report. These either contribute to the state of food insecurity in the Gaza Strip or intersect with contributing factors to further exacerbate the problem. First, the repeated evacuation orders in the north since last October. Reports also indicate that with the intensification of fighting in the north, many civilians were trapped in their homes, unable to leave. Further, some attempting to leave were reportedly being shot at. Second, the number of aid shipments being allowed into Gaza is currently at its lowest since October 2023. The weekly updates provided by OCHA show that denials of requests for humanitarian access, as well as incidents of impeded access, are significantly high, while the number of requests facilitated continues to dwindle. Consequently, though humanitarian assistance is available, it is not allowed to reach civilians who are in desperate need. Third, as civilians waste away from hunger, malnutrition, and disease, there is a simultaneous and steady pummeling of what remains of the healthcare infrastructure, including medical personnel. Consequently, access to healthcare is severely depleted in a time when it is most desperately needed. Mr. President, against the foregoing, Guyana wishes to again highlight the following. The war in Gaza must end immediately and without conditions. We reiterate our call for a ceasefire now. Israel, as the occupying power, must scrupulously comply with its legal obligations to ensure the well-being of the civilians in Gaza. It is illegal to deny the population sustenance and health care and to take actions meant to physically destroy the population. The systematic confluence of factors to maximize the impact of the humanitarian hardships to which Palestinians are subject must be dismantled. The campaign against UNRWA, which culminated in the first instance in the passage of the October 28 legislation, is one such factor which the United Nations must do all in its power to confront. Finally, Mr. President, after a year of senseless killing and maiming, this war on Gaza has reinforced the fact that weapons of pain cannot produce peace, not for Israeli, certainly not for Palestinians, and not for the Middle East. To the contrary, the path to peace still remains the two-state solution, and circumventing this path will continually lead to a place of war and pain. It is time to end the cycle once and for all. Guyana is prepared to work with this Council to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais
Thank you,
aussi
Mr. President. I
remercier
would also
la secrétaire
like to
générale
thank
adjointe aux droits de
the
l'homme,
Under-Secretary General
la
for
secrétaire générale
Human, Assistant
adjointe aux
Secretary
affaires
General for
humanitaires
Human
d'OCHA,
Rights,
ainsi que le directeur du
acting
Bureau des
USG for
urgences
OCHA,
et de la résilience de la
and
FAO,
the Emergency
de
and
leurs
Resilience Office of the
exposés
FAO
sont
for
au
their
plus haut degré
briefings,
alarmants.
which are extremely alarming.
Les informations que nous
The
venons
information that
d'entendre
we have
complètent
just
l'appel
heard
conjoint
complements
récent
the
des agences des
recent
Nations
joint
Unies
appeal from
sur
UN
la situation
agencies
humanitaire encore
on
plus
the
aiguë
even more
à
acute
Gaza
humanitarian
et
situation
l'alerte
in
du
Gaza
comité de la famine
and
du
the
PCI.
alert from the
Et c'est pourquoi mon
ICP
pays,
Famine
avec nos
Committee.
collègues de la
And that is
Guyane,
why my
de
country, with my
l'Algérie et de
colleagues
la
from
Slovénie, a
Guyana,
demandé cette
Algeria, and
séance
Slovenia,
d'urgence
requested this
et nous sommes
emergency meeting.
reconnaissants
And
au
we are
Royaume-Uni
grateful
de
to
l'avoir
the
mis à
United
l'agenda si
Kingdom
rapidement.
for having put it on the agenda
La
so
Suisse
quickly.
remercie aussi toutes et
Switzerland would
tous
also
les
like to thank
humanitaires
all
qui
the
poursuivent leur
humanitarian
mission
workers that
au
are
péril de
continuing
leur
their
propre
mission
vie,
at the
alors
risk
que
of
la
their own
famine
lives,
menace
while
Gaza,
famine threatens
particulièrement dans
Gaza,
le nord.
particularly in the north.
En adoptant la résolution
By adopting
2417,
Resolution
ce Conseil
2417,
a reconnu
this
le lien
Council
entre les conflits
recognized the
armés,
link between armed
l'insécurité
conflict,
alimentaire et le
food
risque de
insecurity,
famine.
and the risk of
Ce
famine.
faisant, il a
In doing
également
so,
réitéré
it
le
also
devoir
reiterated the
qui
duty
incombe à toutes les
incumbent
parties au
upon all
conflit
parties
de
to
respecter leurs
conflict to
obligations en
respect
vertu du
their
droit international
obligations under
humanitaire
international
et des droits
humanitarian
humains, en
and human rights
particulier
law, and in
celles ayant un
particular
impact sur la
those that have an
sécurité
impact on
alimentaire.
food security.
Il y a près de 8 mois, ce Conseil
Nearly 8 months
s'était
ago,
réuni dans
this
le
Council
cadre
met
prévu
within
par la
the
résolution
framework provided by
2417
Resolution
suite à l'appel
2017, following an appeal by OCHA that had made recommendations to resolve this situation, which was already terrible at that time. The implementation of these recommendations is all the more urgent now that food insecurity has become even more acute. Switzerland is deeply concerned by the IPC's warning of imminent famine, despite repeated appeals to the parties to the conflict. They have an obligation to authorize and facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need. As the occupying power, Israel must also ensure, to the best of its ability, that the basic needs of the Gazan population are met. It is important to remember that the use of starvation as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited by international humanitarian law and constitutes a war crime for which those responsible will have to answer. Faced with this situation and in line with the recommendations heard this afternoon and with the IPC alert, Switzerland would like to stress the following urgent measures. Firstly, it is imperative and urgent that a ceasefire agreement is at last reached. Resolutions 2728 and 2735 demanded this. We also call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. Switzerland is actively involved in the negotiations on a draft resolution proposed by the elected members of this Council. Secondly, Switzerland calls on all parties to take immediate, concrete and effective measures to spare and protect the civilian population as required by their obligations under international humanitarian law. This includes, I repeat, the prohibition of using starvation as a method of warfare against the civilian population, the prohibition of attacking, destroying, removing or rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, and the obligation to authorize and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to civilians in need. Humanitarian personnel must be respected and protected as reaffirmed by Resolution 2730. This includes local staff, in particular UNRWA and ICRC staff. Thirdly, commercial food supplies must be guaranteed to be delivered to all areas so that local markets can be re-established. Humanitarian aid alone cannot meet the needs of more than 2 million people. In this context, Switzerland also recalls the central role of local staff of humanitarian agencies and the pivotal role of UNRWA in providing essential services beyond humanitarian aid. Madam President, scientific data that has been presented calls for action. Switzerland, as informal co-focal point in the Council on Conflict and Hunger, together with Guyana, calls on all members of this Council to assume their responsibilities as called for in Resolution 2417. We must find a solution that can put an end to human suffering at long last, and we must urgently revive prospects for peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. First, allow me to thank you for convening this important meeting. I would also like to extend our appreciation to Mrs. Brandt-Keris, Mr. Paulson, and Mrs. Mitsuya for their insight on this critical issue. The worsening situation in Gaza, tragically, was foreseeable, with famine now ravaging the already suffering Palestinian population. Humanitarian organizations have repeatedly sounded the alarm, issuing urgent warnings as the international community remains unable to halt the oppression by the occupying Israeli forces. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, this aggression clearly illustrates the international community failure to enforce universally applicable rules. The catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza is not incidental, but rather a consequence of a deliberate, man-made policy of deprivation imposed by the occupying power. As noted by the United Nations Special Rapporteur for the right to food, and I quote, on 9 October 2023, Israel announced its starvation campaign against Gaza. By December, Palestinians in Gaza made up 80% of the people in the world experiencing famine or catastrophic hunger. Never in post-war history had the population been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely. End of quote. This chilling report underscores the gravity of the deprivation inflicted on Palestinians, particularly in northern Gaza, where people are literally dying from starvation, from famine. This is a clear use of starvation as a method of war, which constitutes a war crime. Madam President, today, words cannot capture the horror endured by civilians in Gaza, especially in the north. The intent behind these policies has become starkly clear. Empty northern Gaza of its inhabitants. This is not a mere speculation. It reflects an established, recognized policy openly acknowledged by Israel, systematically aimed at displacing Palestinians from this area. The Israeli Defense Forces have clearly stated that, and I quote, Palestinians will not be allowed to return to their homes in northern Gaza. This stance blatantly violates UN Security Council resolution, including Resolution 2735, which guarantees the right of displaced persons to return to their home. To make this decision effective, on 6 October 2024, Israel decided the northern Gaza Strip a combat zone, ordering all civilians to evacuate. Médecins Sans Frontières reported that their staff are trapped in Jabalia, stating, and I quote, "Nobody is allowed to get in or out. Anyone who tries in getting is getting shot." During last month of October, civilians in northern Gaza have been under siege with no confirmed food deliveries. Those attempting to obtain aid have faced targeting. And the situation throughout the entire Gaza Strip is appalling. Despite repeated call from the international community, despite resolution adopted by this Council, and despite the established UN mechanism, only 37 trucks entered Gaza per day during the month of October. May I recall that they were more than 500 last year. And this month of October saw the lowest level of humanitarian access to Gaza. And to make things worse, not a single authorization for import of commercial food has been issued by the Israeli authorities. Madam President, amid this crisis, the Israeli occupying authorities decided to halt UNRWA's operation in the occupied Palestinian territories. This constitutes another act of collective punishment against a Palestinian population entirely dependent on these services for survival, further compounding their suffering and denying them their right to life and dignity. The life of children, women, and the elderly, in fact, every civilian in northern Gaza, are at imminent risk. These people cannot be left to face alone an occupying Israeli power that disregards all rules and responsibilities concerning human lives. Let me remind you that the Israeli finance minister stated that, and I quote, "It may be just and moral to starve the 2 million residents in Gaza." End of quote. And we, as members of this Council, must uphold our moral and legal obligations. The resolution put forth by elected members of the Security Council under the coordination of Guyana demands immediate adoption. There is no time to waste. The IPC report warns, and I quote, "Failure to respond to these calls within the next few days will result in a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation and additional, avoidable civilian death." End of quote. This Security Council must act now decisively to impose a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire, an unconditional ceasefire, and a permanent ceasefire to end the collective punishment of the Palestinian people in Gaza and uphold our commitment to international humanitarian law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I also want to thank the briefers, Assistant Brands Carey, Director Paulson, and Acting Undersecretary General Masuya. This meeting takes place in light of the latest Famine Review Committee alert for Gaza, with particular focus on northern Gaza Strip. It is not the first meeting we are holding on man-made hunger in Gaza. It is also not the first meeting on the man-made catastrophic circumstances in the North Gaza. A siege within a siege is unfolding, verging on the apocalyptic situation as recently characterized by the humanitarian agencies present in theater. Protection of civilians is not a political issue. It is a non-negotiable principle. It is a legal obligation. We should therefore take this alert seriously, and I want to put it very straightforward. People in Gaza are starving. Women and men, from children to older persons, are hungry, while 100,000 metric tons of food awaits entry at different corridors around Gaza. Famine in Gaza is predictable, and it is, I repeat, man-made and preventable. The worst-case scenario, with the onset of winter and expected flooding in this low-lying coastal strip, looms over displaced population without basic shelter, surrounded by wastewater, solid waste, and debris. Demolished water facilities expose them to contaminated water resources and shatter local production of food. We fail to understand how one cannot feel the horrible pain of Palestinians in Gaza. As underlined by the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and as just recalled by my colleague from Algeria, never in post-World War history had a population been made to go hungry so quickly and as completely as was the case for Palestinians living in Gaza. Man-made famine is a form of slow violence, causing lasting physical and psychosocial harm to survivors. It generates a social trauma which passes through future generations. More immediately, we are deeply concerned for this generation of children. Stories of children in Gaza unable to cry due to hunger should force us to act now. Their silence must be deafening for their families, their doctors, their communities. The only silence louder is the one of this Council, not acting to prevent the worst from happening. We call for full implementation of all 4 Security Council resolutions related to this war and all ICJ orders on provisional measures. We underline that starvation as a method of warfare is prohibited by international law. We reject all attempts to starve Palestinians in Gaza. More than a year into the war, we cannot accept assurances implying that everything possible is being done for protection of civilian population in Gaza. This is simply not true. The Security Council must demand urgent scaling up the delivery of humanitarian assistance to and within Gaza. The Council must demand urgent scaling up the delivery of commercial goods. The Council must demand full humanitarian access and appropriate space and safety to be granted to humanitarian organizations, both intergovernmental and non-governmental ones. The Council must demand rapid recovery of local food system and recovery of the WASH system. The Security Council must demand an unconditional release of all hostages. To use the words of briefers, time for Council's action is now, within days, not weeks. Colleagues, any effort to prevent famine in Gaza is inherently connected to the situation of UNRWA. This agency is backbone of humanitarian response in Gaza. Its collapse would have unimaginable consequences for people in Gaza. There is no alternative to UNRWA. There is nobody in Gaza that can replace UNRWA. This has been expressed very clearly by all UN agencies and humanitarian organizations, and again today by the briefers. We urge Israeli government to not implement the legislation recently adopted by Knesset. Madam President, this alert is a wake-up call. Failure to provide peace to Middle East cannot be an excuse to fail protecting civilians in the region. We have a responsibility to protect them. Humanitarian situation in itself has become a threat to international peace and security. And this Council must act on it with a clear decision for a ceasefire. Thank you.
Representative of Slovenia for their statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And thanks to Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia, and Switzerland for requesting this meeting. I also thank the briefers for the briefing on the harrowing situation in the Gaza Strip. Malta is extremely concerned about the IPC's declaration of the strong likelihood of famine in the besieged northern areas of Gaza. Food systems have collapsed and aid deliveries are being withheld. This man-made famine is a result of direct actions by the Israeli government, and it is leading to the suffering of millions in Gaza. All told, we are facing a human rights crisis all throughout Gaza and the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Today, the entirety of Gaza's population is facing emergency levels of food insecurity. Tens of thousands of people are being forcibly displaced from North Gaza in violation of international law. As recalled by the heads of UN agencies last week, the situation we are facing in the north is apocalyptic. The persistent actions undertaken by Israel to dismantle UNRWA's vital operations in the entire OPT will collapse the humanitarian response in Gaza and gravely exacerbate this catastrophe. We reiterate our long-standing and unwavering position. The agency is irreplaceable. It serves as a stabilizing force in the region and a vital source of support for Palestinians. It is the backbone of humanitarian assistance to generations of Palestinian refugees, and its work remains essential. President, the recommendations for immediate action made by the IPC must be heeded. Israel must allow immediate, unimpeded access for the delivery of adequate food, water, medical, and nutritional supplies into and throughout Gaza. The siege of northern Gaza must end. It must facilitate repairs to health facilities, water and sanitation infrastructure, and the passage of vital materials required to meet the basic needs of the population. These requirements are binding legal obligations and are neither arbitrary nor negotiable. They are in accordance with Israel's responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention and international humanitarian and human rights law. President, this Council has a responsibility to ensure the maintenance of international peace and security. Inaction and political paralysis are not an option. The world, especially the people of Gaza, are expecting us to rise to the obligations and responsibilities entrusted to us. The E10-led draft resolution will finally address the desperate humanitarian situation in Gaza and the immense suffering of the Gazan population by demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the release of hostages. It would also demand the Israelis' unhindered facilitation of humanitarian assistance at scale to the people of Gaza. This is the only pathway to averting this famine. There is no alternative. President, for more than a year, we have heard the UN, every humanitarian agency, and every human rights group sound alarm. What we are witnessing in Gaza is a defenseless civilian population sheltering in and around schools, hospitals, and aid distribution sites. They must be protected, and Israel's attacks against them should cease immediately. The situation is completely untenable, and there is no more time to waste. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President, for convening this important meeting. I would also like to thank ASG Caris, FAO Director Paulson, and Acting USG Msuya for their sobering and somber briefings. Since the brutal terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israeli citizens in October of last year and the ensuing massive military operations by the Israeli Defense Forces, the world has been witnessing numerous breaches of international humanitarian law. Hamas and other groups murdered innocent civilians and still hold 100 or so hostages, either living or dead. They are continuing rocket attacks on Israeli population centers, shielding themselves in Palestinian civilian infrastructure. But one party's non-observance, even if it is deemed to be a terrorist group, does not provide any legitimate ground for another party's failure to comply with international law for 13 months straight. Regardless of intent, when breaches of international humanitarian law happen, no justification can be given. Numerous times, the Council members have underlined that humanitarian aid must be ensured and starvation must not be employed as a method of warfare. And the IDF has repeatedly claimed it operates in accordance with international law. Let us be clear. Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention provides that the occupying power has the duty of ensuring the food and medical supplies of the population. Under the current situation, where Gaza is entirely controlled by the IDF, it is undoubtedly the obligation of Israel, not the United Nations, nor the remnants of the de facto regime in Gaza, to ensure necessary food and medical goods for Palestinian civilians. The IPC Famine Review Committee's alert last week, citing the IPC report in October, clearly shows that Israel is not doing enough, as famine is now imminent in the north. It is also extremely alarming that the entire Gaza Strip is classified in IPC Phase 4, an emergency level. Israel must protect civilians and permit entry of sufficient humanitarian cargo into Gaza. But its obligation does not end there. Israel should actively facilitate the delivery of aid throughout Gaza, and displaced civilians must be permitted to return to their homes as soon as possible. Thus, we condemn Israeli military officials' reckless and inflammatory rhetoric reported last week that I quote, "No one will be allowed to return to the northern Gaza, and no humanitarian aid will be allowed there, because there are no civilians left in the area," unquote. These remarks are clearly inconsistent with the current reality of northern Gaza, where numerous civilians have no choice but to stay as a result of injury, lack of safety, age, or no guarantee of security to move to other areas, following multiple displacements. Such remarks can also be read as an acknowledgement of violations of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which provides that persons shall be transferred back to their homes as soon as hostilities have ceased. Any attempt at demographic or territorial change in Gaza, including Israeli politicians' call for resettling in Gaza, must be rejected. Madam President, in spite of the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council, the conflict in Gaza continues to be prolonged, and repeated violations of international humanitarian law have persisted. There should be no delay in ending the current conflict. Thus, the Republic of Korea strongly calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Hostages still held must be immediately released. This is the only way to guarantee mass delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza and to prepare a serious reconstruction plan. We hope another Council product to this end can be soon adopted and implemented. Lastly, we reiterate that there is no substitute for UNRWA. Without UNRWA, the entire burden would be borne by Israel to ensure all humanitarian aid and public services like health and education throughout the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. IHL is clear. Israel, as the occupying power under the Geneva Convention, must seriously consider once again all their obligations. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Le agradezco, Presidenta, por la convocatoria a esta sesión informativa y también doy las gracias a la subsecretaria Brand Kerris, a la secretaria general adjunta en funciones suya y al director Paulsen por sus exposiciones informativas. El Ecuador, que con Irlanda copreside el Grupo de Amigos contra el Hambre y Conflicto, está profundamente preocupado por la situación de inseguridad alimentaria en Gaza. En febrero pasado mantuvimos una reunión en la que tratamos la crítica situación humanitaria por la que atravesaba el norte de la Franja de Gaza a causa del conflicto. Lamentablemente, y como lo evidencia la alerta emitida por el Comité de Revisión de la Hambruna, en los últimos meses la situación ha experimentado un constante y rápido deterioro, al punto que es posible que ya se haya superado los umbrales de hambruna o que esto esté próximo a ocurrir. Los factores que estarían precipitando una verdadera catástrofe humanitaria son el desplazamiento de la población civil a causa de las hostilidades, el colapso de los sistemas alimentarios, la destrucción de instalaciones de atención sanitaria y nutricional y otras infraestructuras civiles, así como las dificultades de operación de UNRWA. Las alarmantes estadísticas sobre los niveles de inseguridad alimentaria están configurando el peor escenario
worst picture in the north of Gaza, characterized by hunger and increasing levels of mortality due to malnutrition and disease, mainly affecting vulnerable groups such as women, children, and older persons. In light of the pace of the deterioration of food security, which calls for an extremely urgent response, Ecuador supports the recommendations of the Famine Review Committee. These highlight the link between hunger and conflict. For these reasons, my delegation underscores the following. Firstly, Ecuador calls on all parties to take concrete steps to protect the civilian population and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law, including Resolution 2417. Secondly, and as is recognized by the June 2024 report, the situation could be reversed with the entry and distribution of food supplies. Consequently, it's urgent to enable the access of humanitarian aid and fully implement Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2735. Thirdly, while action to address the humanitarian needs of the population is essential and urgent, Ecuador insists that lasting peace is the only sustainable response to the risk of hunger. A ceasefire and the release of hostages are the first steps to that peace and must happen immediately. My country will continue supporting initiatives to achieve a peaceful, negotiated, definitive and just solution to the conflict with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, coexisting in peace and security. To conclude, Madam President, Ecuador thanks the humanitarian workers for all of their efforts to alleviate the pressing needs of the population. Their protection and security must be guaranteed so that they can carry out their work. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Keris, Director Paulsen, and Acting USG Musuya for their sobering briefings. Madam President, Japan is deeply disturbed by findings in the IPC Famine Review Committee alert and 6-month update report by OHCHR on the human rights situation in Gaza, both published on November 8, which highlight the catastrophic conditions in Gaza. The IPC alert is shocking, revealing the humanitarian situation in Gaza Strip is extremely grave and rapidly deteriorating, and the famine is highly likely to become imminent in northern Gaza. The OHCHR report also highlights by January 2024, starvation became a reality for Palestinians, particularly in the north, with the most vulnerable populations, such as infants and the elderly. The far insufficient flow of aid into northern Gaza over the past month is unacceptable. While we acknowledge Israel has reopened the Kisfim crossing today, additional urgent efforts are imperative to improve humanitarian access to the Strip. In this context, Japan reiterates its grave concern over the adoption by the Israeli Knesset of the bills imposing severe restrictions on UNRWA. The agency is absolutely essential for the delivery of humanitarian relief in Gaza in this desperate hour. We also understand the agency's full commitment to take further steps to ensure its neutrality, including through the implementation of the Corona report. Let us recall that Israel has been strongly encouraged, including by the ICJ, to fully cooperate with the UN to ensure unhindered provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance. We are concerned about what the loss of UNRWA's functioning is expected to bring about on the grounds of the region. Israel's responses to the situation, including the adoption of Knesset bills, appear inconsistent with the obligations under international humanitarian law. Recalling Security Council Resolution 2417, we emphasize that starvation must not be used as a weapon of war, and deliberate mass displacement must not take place. Madam President, Japan remains steadfast and proactive in its commitment to provide support to the most vulnerable and has provided approximately $130 million in humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people since October 7th last year. Japan also gravely alarmed by the OHCHR report outlining the human rights situation in Gaza, which includes accounts of civilian casualties, the use of human shields, indiscriminate projectile attacks, attacks on hospitals and humanitarian and medical workers, widespread displacement within Gaza, and hostage situations. Japan once again strongly demands the release of all remaining hostages and reiterates its unequivocal and strong condemnation of the horrific terror attacks and hostage-taking committed by Hamas and others on October 7th last year. We continue to repeat our unwavering demand that all parties to conflict must act in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international humanitarian rights law. Madam President, only an immediate ceasefire and the immediate release of hostages can end the catastrophe. All relevant parties must strive to bring a halt to the fighting without delay. Japan will continue tirelessly in its diplomatic efforts to that end. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢阿尔及利亚、圭亚那、斯洛文尼亚和瑞士倡议召开此次会议。感谢姆苏亚代理副秘书长、凯里斯助理秘书长和鲍尔森主任的通报。 民以食为天，吃上饭，吃饱饭，这是人类的最基本需求。
is the most basic
人
need
道问
of
题
human
不能政
beings.
治化，饥
Humanitarian
饿
issues
不
cannot
能
be
武器化，
politicized, nor
这
can
是国
hunger
际
be
人道法
weaponized.
规定的基
This
本
is
底
the
线。
fundamental bottom line
然而
of the international
在持续
humanitarian law.
13个月的加沙
However,
冲突
during the
中，
conflict in Gaza,
平
which
民
has
的
been
基本
ongoing
需
for
求
13
被反
months,
复剥夺，
civilians have been
所有
repeatedly
人的
deprived of
所
their
有的
basic
人道
needs,
底线
and all
被一再
humanitarian
突
bottom
破。
lines have been
粮农
breached
组织
time and again.
粮农组织
FAO's
IPC 饥
IPC
荒
Famine
评估
Review
委员
Committee
会最
in
新
its
报告
latest
发出警
report
告：
has warned
加沙人道
that
物资准
access
入
for
降到了历
humanitarian
史最低水
supplies to
平，
Gaza has fallen to
人
an
道
all-time
人道
low,
局势十
and
分
that
严
the
峻，
already
而且
dire
还在
humanitarian
迅速恶
situation
化。
there is rapidly
在北部加
deteriorating,
沙，
with an
一场严
imminent
重的
risk
饥荒
of severe
即将
famine
爆
in
发。
northern Gaza.
令人感到关切的
It is
是，
worrisome
这场灾难
that this
不是
catastrophe
人类
is
无法
not
控
a
制的
natural
天灾，
disaster beyond human
也不是
control,
毫无预
nor
兆
has it
突然
fallen
降
in
临
an。unforeseen manner.
在过去1年里，
Over the past
以色
year,
列持
Israel
续
has
对加
continued
沙
its indiscriminate
狂轰滥
bombing
炸
in Gaza,
袭击医院、
attacking
学校、
hospitals,
难
schools,
民营，
and refugee
切断
camps,
食品、
cutting off
药
supply
品
of food,
和燃料
medicine,
供
and
应，
fuel,
反复
and
大规
repeatedly
模强迫
forcing
转移
massive
平民，
relocation of
造
civilians.
成了前
Such
所未有
acts
的人
have
道灾难
resulted in
和破坏。
unprecedented humanitarian
妇
catastrophe
女
and
儿童
destruction,
占到了
with
平民
women
伤
and
亡的大
children
多数。
accounting for the majority of
许
civilian
多分析指
casualties.
出，
According
在
to
加
numerous
沙限
analyses,
制和剥夺平
restrictions
民
on
获得
and
粮食的
denial
权
of
利，
civilians' right to
是
food
针
in
对巴勒
Gaza
斯坦民众的
constitutes
系
part
统
of
性集体
systematic
惩罚的
collective
一部分。
punishment of the Palestinian population.
在全世界
The
众目睽睽
unfolding
之
of
下
such a tragedy
发
in
生这
front
样
of
的
the eyes
惨
of the
剧，
world people
是对人
is
类
a
良
test
知
on
和
human
国际
conscience
法治
and
的
the
拷问。
international rule of law.
必须指出，
It must be
扩大
pointed
对
out
加沙的
that
人道
the
救援
biggest
最大的
challenge
挑
in
战，
scaling up
不是人道
humanitarian
物资供应
assistance
不
to
足，
Gaza does not lie in
而
the
是
shortage of
人道准
humanitarian
入
supplies,
受到
but
人为
lies
限制。
in the man-made restrictions
国
on
际社会
humanitarian
向
access.
加沙
The
援助了
international
大量物
community
资，
has mobilized
只能在
huge supplies for
过境
Gaza,
点外
which
采
have to
取
stay
长
in the
队
long
等待。
line outside the crossing
我们敦
points,
促以
waiting
色
to
列
enter Gaza.
立即开放
We
全
urge
部过
Israel
境
to
点，
immediately open
切
all
实
crossings
消
and
除人道
effectively
物资
remove
进入加
obstacles
沙
to
全境的
humanitarian
障碍。
access throughout Gaza.
卡格高级协调
Senior
员根据
Coordinator
安理
Clark
会第
has been
2720号决
facilitating
议授权
humanitarian
推
access
动
in
加沙
Gaza
人道
as
准入。
mandated by Council
我们期
Resolution
待他的工作
2720. We
取得
look
实
forward
质
to
进展。
substantive progress in her work.
必须指出，
It must be
加
pointed
沙
out
一再面
that
临人
the
道困境，
humanitarian
并
hardships
不是因为
repeatedly
人
seen
道
in
机构
Gaza
的努力
are
不
not
够，
a result of
而
inadequate
是
efforts by
人
the
道行动
humanitarian
遭
agencies,
到
but a
重重
result
设障。
of numerous
以色列
obstacles to
一边限制人道
humanitarian
行
work.
动，一边
Israel
指
is
责联合
restricting
国和人
humanitarian
道机
access
构
on the
不
one
作
hand
为，
and
这不可
accusing
接
the
受。
UN and the humanitarian
我
agencies
们
of
呼吁
inaction on
以
the
色列
other.
同联
This
合
is
国
unacceptable.
等人道
We
机
call
构
on
开
Israel
展
to
全
fully
面合作，
cooperate with the UN
保
and
障
other
人道机
humanitarian
构的安
agencies,
全和便利。
ensure their safety and facilitate
当
their
前
work.
在这
At
方面的
present,
一个突
one
出问题
prominent
是，
issue in this
以色列
regard
议会
is
通过
the
法
bills
案
adopted
关
by
闭
the
联合国
Knesset
近
to
东巴勒
close
斯坦难
UNRWA,
民救济和工程处，这将切
which
断
will
加沙民
cut off
众
the
赖以生
lifeline
存的
crucial
生
to the
命线。
survival of the Gazan
中方
population.
再次
China
谴
once
责
again
任何打
condemns
压
any
和限制
repression
工
of
程
and
处的做法。
restrictions on UNRWA.
有关法案
The
必
relevant
须
bills
停止实
shall be
施，
ceased in implementation and shall be revoked as soon as possible. It must be pointed out that what is most lacking in conducting humanitarian assistance in Gaza is not the material supplies or other policy conditions, but the political will of a key party. The recent completion of WHO's polio vaccination in Gaza has once again demonstrated that it is possible to expand humanitarian assistance. The key to the issue is that Israel, as the occupying power, must fulfill its obligations under the international law and should not be permitted to use humanitarian assistance as a bargaining chip. We have noted that whenever international public opinion or criticism from a certain country goes stronger, humanitarian assistance in Gaza would seem to be progressing. This in turn shows that the occupying power has not exhausted all its efforts and that there is still enormous space for action to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. President, an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza and an early implementation of the two-state solution is a fundamental path towards ending the conflict and restoring peace. China calls on Israel to heed the appeal of the international community, stop its military actions in Gaza, and stop its violations against Lebanon and other countries. The 10 elected members of the Council have tabled a draft resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, which is in line with the international expectations for the Council. China welcomes the action of E10 and supports the Council's early adoption of the draft resolution. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Brans Keris, Acting USG Joyce Musea, and Director Ren Paulson for their briefings. Madam President, civilians have borne the brunt of the war in the Gaza Strip, with at least 43,000 people killed, over 100,000 injured, and nearly 1.9 million displaced, many of them repeatedly. Civilians have had their homes, schools, markets, and all semblance of normal socio-economic life destroyed. They virtually live in perpetual fear and constant deprivation. In the absence of a ceasefire, the men, women, and children caught up in this conflict have no safe refuge. International humanitarian law, including the rules of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, is being repeatedly challenged with no exception, no protection, and no respect for the rights and dignity of persons. The resolutions adopted by this Council since the onset of the cycle of conflict in October 2023 have all been aimed at preventing the devastating humanitarian impact of war. It is unfortunate that affairs that propelled the Security Council to adopt Resolution 2417 in 2018, that armed conflicts and violence have devastating humanitarian consequences, often hindering an effective humanitarian response, and are a major cause of the risk of famine, are tragically unfolding in the Gaza Strip, where the food systems have collapsed and humanitarian aid flows are at their lowest levels. Previous and current reports from United Nations humanitarian personnel and other partners emphasize the grim reality of death and suffering in the Gaza Strip, with October reportedly recording the lowest number of aid trucks entering Gaza since November 23 at 58 per day. This is a sharp decline from the approximately 200 aid trucks per day recorded in August 2024. Northern Gaza remains particularly at risk, with reports indicating that it is almost impossible to deliver food aid and supplies to its approximately 75,000 to 90,000 estimated residents. We are particularly concerned with the recent Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC alert of 8 November 2024 that, quote, an imminent and substantial likelihood of famine is occurring in the Gaza Strip due to the rapidly deteriorating situation, end of quote. The IPC report has classified the entire Gaza Strip as an IPC Phase 4 acute food insecurity, with IPC Phase 3 levels of acute malnutrition in September to October 2024. The non-availability of food due to the halt of agricultural and economic activity, as well as the access constraints, mainly caused by insecurity, blockades, and other administrative and operational restrictions, have caused the IPC Famine Review Committee to conclude that, quote, starvation, malnutrition, and excess mortality due to malnutrition and disease are rapidly increasing in the Gaza Strip, especially in the north, end of quote. This assessment echoes the statement issued by heads of 15 UN and humanitarian organizations, including acting USG Museya, at the start of this month, that the entire Palestinian population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence. Madam President, current happenings in the Gaza Strip violate all Security Council resolutions, including resolutions 2417, 2573, and 2730, that strongly call for the respect and protection of the civilian population, including humanitarian personnel and civilian objects. In this connection, we are deeply concerned that Qatar will pause mediation efforts for a Gaza ceasefire and hostage release deals until Hamas and Israel show a sincere willingness to return to the negotiating table. We therefore urge Israel and Hamas to demonstrate good faith and sincere willingness to recommit to the negotiations in order to agree to a ceasefire to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people. In seeking an end to this tragedy that is worsening day by day, Sierra Leone will engage and call for the following actions. First, we join the 15 UN and humanitarian organizations of the Interagency Standing Committee to reiterate the appeal for parties to the conflict to protect all civilians in the Gaza Strip as stipulated in resolutions 2417, 2573, and 2730. Second, we reiterate our call for the full respect of international humanitarian law that will allow for the unimpeded supply of food, water, medical, and other essential items to enter the Gaza Strip without further delay. Third, we emphasize the indispensable role of UNRWA, acknowledging the reliance of the entire humanitarian community on its extensive capacity and comparative advantages in providing daily aid and supporting accelerated full aid delivery to millions of Palestinians in the region. We therefore call on the State of Israel to reconsider its recent legislation and desist from actions that may impact the operations of UNRWA in the occupied Palestinian territory. Lastly, Sierra Leone reiterates its support for any effort or initiative by this Council that will demand an immediate ceasefire, release of all the remaining hostages, and the full implementation of all the resolutions adopted on this question since the 7th October 2023. Let us treat this subject with the urgency required to save lives and rescue succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, OHCHR Assistant Secretary General Keris, OCHA Acting Undersecretary General Musuya, and FAO Director Paulson for your briefings. There's no need to mince words here. As we heard from our briefers, the situation in northern Gaza is dire, catastrophic, as we heard from Ms. Musuya. An unconscionable number of Palestinian civilians, many women and children, have been killed. And according to the latest assessment from the IPC, nearly every civilian in Gaza is without adequate food, medication, clean drinking water, or housing. They simply cannot be left to suffer indefinitely. As Secretary Blinken has emphasized, we need to end the armed conflict, bring the hostages home, including the 7 Americans held by Hamas, and chart a path forward in the post-conflict period that provides governance, security, and reconstruction in Gaza. As we consider that future, we must immediately surge humanitarian aid to civilians throughout Gaza, or many of them may not survive the winter. The IPC's latest report on the prospect of imminent famine underscores the urgency of the situation, and it makes clear that such a surge is critical. The United States, too, has made clear to Israel that it must address the undisputed humanitarian crisis. So far, thanks to intervention by the United States, Israel has taken some important steps, including restoring aid deliveries to the north. Still, Israel must ensure its actions are fully implemented and its improvements sustained over time. Only a sustained flow of assistance, coupled with restoration of basic services, including health and nutrition activities, healthcare and water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure, can alleviate the catastrophic levels of food insecurity found in the IPC report. And we continue to reiterate there must be no forcible displacement nor policy of starvation in Gaza, which would have grave implications under U.S. and international law. Colleagues, UNRWA's role has been vital as the front line of this humanitarian response. The agency facilitates approximately 80% of humanitarian aid in Gaza. At present, it is indispensable. And so we repeat the urgent importance of Israel pausing implementation of legislation targeting UNRWA. However, let's be clear. The United States shares Israel's concerns that a small number of UNRWA's personnel were involved in the October 7th attack, and others have ties to Hamas and other armed groups. We're also concerned that some of UNRWA's facilities were compromised by Hamas, which is unacceptable. It is in no party's interest to have the neutrality of UNRWA personnel remain in doubt. We once again call on the Secretary General to facilitate an independent mechanism to review and address all allegations. But it should be possible to address these allegations while sustaining a vital lifeline to Palestinian civilians in need. Again, it is essential there is no interruption of humanitarian aid delivery. Colleagues, the work before us to forge a ceasefire is difficult, but it is necessary. The challenge of helping a revitalized Palestinian Authority rebuild Gaza without Hamas is immense, and the humanitarian crisis facing millions of Palestinian civilians is daunting. But these obstacles are not insurmountable, and we cannot succumb to inaction. We need to give Palestinians a future to look forward to with self-determination and security without Hamas being a part of it. We need Israel to feel secure within its own borders. We need to save lives, the lives of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the lives of hostages who have now gone over a year since seeing their families, and the lives of generations to come of Palestinians and Israelis alike who deserve to live in peace. The United States will continue to work for a ceasefire and find a way to end the armed conflict so that hostages can return home to their loved ones. Palestinians and Israelis can live in security and peace. And we will continue to work tirelessly to surge life-saving assistance to those in desperate need. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I commend the UK's presidency for convening this briefing, and to Guyana, Switzerland, Algeria, and Slovenia for bringing this critical matter to the attention of the Council. We also thank our briefers, Ms. Ilse Brands-Keris, Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mr. Rain Paulson, Director from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and Ms. Joyce Nsuya, Acting Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, for their comprehensive insights highlighting the gravity of the situation in Gaza. Madam President, on February 27, 2024, This Council convened to address the imminent risk of food insecurity in Gaza after 4 months of conflict. Today, more than 12 months later, Israel military operations have created deplorable conditions across Gaza. Humanitarian organizations report that the prolonged siege of northern Gaza has rendered the area uninhabitable, and it is a heartbreaking situation which has now reached catastrophic proportions, necessitating immediate and sustained humanitarian intervention. Evidence strongly indicates that famine is imminent in northern Gaza. This development demands our most urgent attention and requires decisive and immediate action from this Council. Madam President, as we have consistently reiterated, the protection of civilians in armed conflict is a fundamental principle of international humanitarian law. It is therefore the responsibility of all parties involved in conflicts to ensure that civilians are safeguarded from harm. Failure to do so, it's not only a violation of international norms, but also morally reprehensible. As the Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Joyce Msuya, stated in one of our previous sessions, I quote, if it is to have any real meaning for the millions of civilians affected by the war in Gaza, it is time to go above and beyond compliance, to strive for the full protection of civilians against the full range of harms they are suffering on our watch, end quote. Therefore, the obligation to ensure civilian protection falls unequivocally upon all parties engaged in the conflict. And deviation from this principle constitutes not only a violation of international norms, but represents a fundamental moral failure to avert and alleviate this catastrophic situation. Immediate intervention is imperative from all parties directly involved in the conflict and those wielding influence over its conduct to prevent and mitigate this humanitarian catastrophe. In this context, the Council and Member States must mandate and ensure compliance with the comprehensive protection framework to alleviate the famine in Gaza Strip through the following essential actions. First, end the siege in the northern areas of Gaza Strip and the cessation of attacks on healthcare facilities and other essential civilian infrastructure. Second, implement an immediate and unconditional ceasefire to facilitate humanitarian aid delivery, including food, water, and medical supplies. This includes reopening border crossings to enable unhindered flow and efficient aid distribution. Third, apply a coordinated international diplomatic pressure to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law and to prevent the use of starvation as a weapon of war. Fourth, mobilize substantial additional funding and resources to support humanitarian operations in Gaza, including appeals to donor countries and international organizations, particularly those who have suspended their contribution to UNRWA, to re-engage and support relief efforts. Lastly, work towards long-term solutions to address the root cause of the crisis in Gaza, mindful of the fact that achieving sustainable peace and stability ultimately hinges on a political solution. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we're grateful to Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia and Switzerland for the initiative of convening today's Security Council meeting in connection with the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We thank Ms. Brans-Karis, Mr. Paulsen and Ms. Msuya for their overview of the humanitarian catastrophe playing out before our eyes and their assessment of the situation of ensuring food security for the enclave, in particular in the north. The recent publication of the report of the IPC Famine Review Committee notes that the food system in the Gaza Strip is not just not coping, it has collapsed. The population of the entire enclave, more than 2 million people, are essentially in a state of critical food insecurity. That is the fourth phase of the absence of food security according to the relevant UN scale, which is followed by genuine famine and starvation. Particularly alarming are the forecasts that in the coming months in the north of Gaza, widespread famine is expected, and unfortunately there are grounds for making such assessments. In these circumstances, the Israeli Defense Force continues its merciless military operation, causing the civilian population yet more suffering. Palestinians who have been able to survive under the regular artillery shelling and air attacks have been forced to constantly move around the enclave in search of food and shelter. Those that aren't able to leave the territory where the IDF has ordered another evacuation are caught in a trap. Essentially, the Gazan civilians that remain are being asked either to die of starvation or from artillery shelling and bombings. That is being said directly by representatives of the UN humanitarian branch, including the heads of the WHO and UNRWA. And yet, everything that's happening in Gaza is part of the targeted efforts of the authorities of Israel to create a so-called security buffer zone. Such actions by the Israelis are now visible in the south of Lebanon as well, where, as a result of the scorched earth tactics, the civilian population is being deprived of what it needs to survive, and the affected areas, including agricultural areas, are being rendered unfit for anything. Madam President, in refusing to end their punitive operation against Palestinian women and children in Gaza, Israel is also continuing, despite the numerous appeals from the international community, to restrict the supplies of humanitarian assistance. There is no sense in counting the number of operational border crossings, because even if some of them are formally operational, their throughput capacity is extremely small. The data thus far is a clear illustration of that. We're talking about the lowest amount of humanitarian goods brought into Gaza since the beginning of the military operation, a daily average of only 58 trucks, which is infinitesimally small given the current needs. And this horrific humanitarian situation has taken shape almost a year after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2720, which was supposed to establish and facilitate the supply of assistance to Gaza. And yet the special mechanism of the UN Senior Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs and Reconstruction in Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, has remained a dead letter. Those members of the Council that from time to time talk about some positive results in Ms. Kaag's work need to acknowledge that her efforts, however active and noble they may be, have not brought the desired results. And this is a clear fact that is difficult to dispute. In this context, the Israeli authorities have taken the decision to declare UNRWA and its staff members outside the law. In circumstances in which there is no alternative to the agency, these actions cannot be seen as anything other than the opposite of humane. And yet it is clear that Israel, as the occupying power, is not fulfilling its obligations under international humanitarian law, nor the independent guaranteeing of protection for the civilian population on the territory that they control, as well as the supply of humanitarian assistance, including food. Now, Gazans are also being deprived of the only international life belt for which there is simply no replacement. UNRWA's work is not just about the distribution of humanitarian rations among those in the population that need them. The agency, for decades, carried out extremely important work to ensure the functioning of the education and healthcare system, social protection, and infrastructure development. The undermining of this structure would lead to the most serious socio-economic consequences for the entire region. We condemn the Knesset decisions and we call for them to immediately be reconsidered. Madam President, we have noted that the aforementioned IPC Famine Review Committee addressed its conclusions and recommendations on the need to provide unhindered humanitarian access and for the lifting of blockades in northern areas and ending attacks on civilian infrastructure. It addressed them not just to the parties of the conflict. The report contains a call on parties that have an influence on the conflict. I think that colleagues, everyone understands which state, first and foremost, is being referred to. It's just a shame that the experts that prepare these publications and UN representatives in general are not saying directly that it is the USA that has every opportunity to facilitate the end to this bloodshed. To do that, as a minimum, the American representatives need to stop blocking Security Council decisions on a cessation of hostilities and, together with everyone else, unambiguously demand that the Israeli authorities set up a fully fledged and unhindered humanitarian access to those casualties and those in need. Over the little more than a year since the tragic events of the 7th of October, by indulging Israel, Washington should share with West Jerusalem the responsibility, the blame for the death of more than 43,000 Palestinians, including those killed from the regularly supplied American weapons and those killed by hunger and infectious diseases. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, in the current circumstances, the Security Council must, as quickly as possible, break out of the paralysis in which, thanks to the US's efforts, it has spent the last few months hearing constant mantras about an impending deal between Israel and Hamas. If West Jerusalem were ready to reach an agreement, it would have done so long ago, rather than advancing more and more conditions, and Israeli officials at every level wouldn't have been talking about their intentions to put an end to Hamas once and for all. We'll say it clearly, our American colleagues have intentionally led us all by the nose, buying time for Israel to carry out its plans to exterminate as many Palestinians as possible in Gaza and to turn this territory into a place that is absolutely unfit for human life. The time has come to act. For that reason, Russia expresses full support for the E10's non-permanent members' draft resolution on Gaza with a direct demand for the immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire and the release of all hostages, and calls for it to be put to a vote. We call for it to be put to a vote without further delay. The adoption of this document would be a belated but proper step to ending the slaughter, getting the Palestinian-Israeli conflict out of this dead end, and a prologue to relaunching the peace process on the universally recognized international legal basis, including the two-state solution. Any other path to bringing about a just and lasting peace in the Middle East does not exist. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie
Elizabeth Keris,
Monsieur Paulsen et Joyce
Mr. Paulsen and Joyce Moussouya for their briefings.
Le Conseil de sécurité doit réagir face à la catastrophe humanitaire en cours à Gaza, où la situation continue de se détériorer. Le dernier rapport du Comité d'examen de la famine alerte sur la forte probabilité que la famine soit déjà présente ou imminente pour les populations du nord de Gaza. Ces informations appellent une mobilisation immédiate. En 2018, ce Conseil adoptait la résolution 2417 qui condamnait pour la première fois l'utilisation de la famine comme arme de guerre, l'absence d'accès humanitaire et la privation des civils de biens indispensables à leur survie. Cette résolution s'impose à Israël comme à tous. Les blocages imposés au nord de Gaza doivent être levés sans délai. L'ensemble des points de passage doivent être réouverts et l'aide humanitaire livrée de façon sûre, massive et sans entrave. La France appelle Israël à assurer la protection de tous les civils et toutes les infrastructures civiles, rappelle que tout déplacement forcé de population constitue une violation grave du droit international. Face à l'urgence humanitaire absolue, les agences des Nations Unies jouent un rôle indispensable, y compris l'UNRWA. La France déplore l'adoption par la Knesset des lois portant sur l'UNRWA et appelle Israël à respecter ses obligations internationales vis-à-vis de l'UNRWA et des Nations Unies. Elle réaffirme son plein soutien à l'UNRWA sans qui des centaines de milliers de Gazaouis n'auraient pas accès aux soins les plus élémentaires et à son indispensable réforme. L'UNRWA apporte de l'aide humanitaire par elle-même, mais sert aussi de plateforme pour que les autres organisations humanitaires puissent le faire. Madame la Présidente, la France condamne les attaques terroristes et les violences sexuelles commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023. Elle rappelle son attachement indéfectible à la sécurité d'Israël. Tous les otages doivent être libérés sans délai. Seule la fin de la guerre permettra d'éloigner durablement la perspective de la famine à Gaza. Il est donc urgent de parvenir à un cessez-le-feu immédiat et permanent dans la bande de Gaza. C'est la seule solution pour mettre un terme au désastre humanitaire qui se déroule sous nos yeux. La France, en lien avec ses partenaires, poursuivra ses efforts visant à mettre fin à ce conflit et à mettre en œuvre la solution des deux États. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, the State of Palestine thanks Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia, and Switzerland for calling for this very important and timely meeting. We also want to express our appreciation to the three briefers for their for sharing with us the stunning facts about the horrifying reality of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip, especially in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Madam President, the very survival of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians is at stake, notably in northern Gaza. They are being killed and starved to death, moved around like cattle from one place to another, from one death to another. According to OCHA, the most represented category of age among those killed are children, notably from age 5 to 9, and newborns to 4 years old. And there are kids maimed, disabled for life, amputated, orphaned, starving, traumatized. There is no regard for children's lives or civilian lives, no regard for international law or the most basic rules of humanity. There is a brutal, barbaric war against the Palestinian people, unrelenting, inhumane, criminal attack against every shred of life and all the requirements of life in the Gaza Strip. This council met a year ago, and it was already clear what trajectory we were on. We knew then that we were on the path that leads from mass killings to genocide, from starvation to famine, from mass bombing to wanton destruction, from evacuation orders to forcible displacement, from so-called military operations to annexation, from the risk of regional escalation to the certainty of regional war. The agony of the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, instead of ending, is now coupled with the suffering of our brothers and sisters in Lebanon, with no regard for the sanctity of civilian life and for the sovereignty of Lebanon. Everything we warned against, everything Israel denied, is happening before our eyes. We are at the last stages of an orchestrated plan to empty wide areas of Gaza from its Palestinian population and to inflict upon the Palestinian civilian population conditions that would lead to its destruction if it refused to leave. Let us all pause and understand what it means that northern Gaza is facing now famine, while aid is available and is only a couple of miles away. Let us pause and understand what it means that Israel has decided and implemented famine as a method of war for the purposes of ethnic cleansing and to advance its colonial objectives. Israel tells us trucks are entering and crossings are open and markets are flourishing, or blames others for the siege it is imposing, while the UN, humanitarian NGOs, and all states around the world are saying the opposite, that aid is not allowed in, and when allowed in, is prevented from reaching the people that need it, that starvation has prevailed by design, that forcible displacement is taking place. Who should be believed? Will I have a solution? Israel, which has been killing Palestinian journalists, 182 of them that we celebrated the other day in Geneva in a conference, killing Palestinian journalists to stop them from reporting under false pretext, can allow the international media into Gaza to report on who is responsible for what, on the real conditions in Gaza, on the magnitude of this human-made, occupation-made catastrophe. But Israel will not, because it knows that what the international media will report will provoke a moral and political earthquake. They come and lie to the media and the stakeout outside, but they refuse to allow the media to go and report for itself the facts, and we are grateful for all UN agencies and the briefers who are with us for telling the facts as they are and the lies of the government of Israel and their representative. Nowhere is this more true than northern Gaza, where Israel considered that there are no civilians left and that all those who remained became military targets, justifying killing them and starving them to death. Never before in our international law-based order had any country claimed that an entire civilian population, children, women, and men, was a legitimate military target. Never again. Never happened. Madam President, the ICJ issued clear provisional orders to address what it characterized as a real and imminent risk for the right of the Palestinian people to be protected from acts of genocide. Can anyone around this table argue that Israel has not been deliberately and totally in breach of these orders? What are the implications of such a breach over months? It seems obvious that what was a real and imminent risk then is a terrifying reality now. What we need now is what we needed all along: an unconditional, immediate ceasefire let me say it again, an unconditional ceasefire and the immediate entry of life-saving assistance, especially to the north. We need the release of hostages and of Palestinian prisoners. We need the return of people to the areas from which they were displaced, alongside a tremendous effort for immediate relief and reconstruction. We need full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and initiatives towards an end of occupation and shared peace and security. It should be noted that families of hostages and prisoners and that bereaved families, Palestinian and Israelis, are calling for a ceasefire because they know it is the only way to save lives, the only way for families to be reunited or to be able to mourn. Let us not speak in their name to justify more killing. Let's not speak on their name to justify more killing. Listen to them. Let us not use them as pretext for further violence and parade them in the United Nations for the wrong reasons. Violence is an impasse. Our region has witnessed enough wars to know it. Madam President, 76 years ago, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were dispossessed and displaced, finding themselves refugees in tents. They needed everything, food and shelter. But the first concern of our parents was education. For decades to come, the world would speak of the Palestinian nation who founded schools in tents and gave the region and the world one of the most educated people on earth, providing teachers to numerous countries and bringing up generations of doctors and artists and engineers. In that endeavor, UNRWA was and remains crucial. In the terrible loss and pain and suffering our people are enduring today, as the genocide continues unfolding before our eyes, with the aim once again to uproot our people, and while hunger and famine are tearing their organs apart, our people are still concerned that a generation of Palestinians have missed a full school year and may miss another. They ache as they see their schools and universities blown up, as they understand Israel is destroying their hopes after having destroyed their homes. The rights of Palestine refugees to return and their status is not subject to the existence of any agency. So if Israel thinks that by trying to destroy UNRWA, it can get rid of this issue, it is mistaken. Our right to return is a cornerstone of our rights, and it is rooted in international law. The Israeli legislation aiming to destroy UNRWA at the time it is most needed is both an attack against the United Nations and against the Palestine refugees it was created to serve, and against the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, who are facing a catastrophic humanitarian crisis. Creating more despair, attacking the agency that helped refugees free themselves from want will not resolve anything. It will fuel the fire we are trying to desperately to stop. Madam President, this is it. Everything we feared is here. The only question that remains is, will we do anything differently now? Smotrich, who has a tendency to spell out clearly what is the policy of the Israeli government, is openly advancing annexation, allowing himself to speak to the intentions of the incoming U.S. administration. We trust that his assumptions are wrong and that unlawful annexation will be opposed by all. The Palestinian people are faced with death, dispossession, and displacement yet again, but once again, they will not disappear. We will not disappear. We are rooted in our land as the olive trees, we call them the Romans, that are rooted in our soil. Only a just and peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine will lead to shared peace and security in our region, as reiterated by the Arab leaders at the Arab Islamic Summit held in Riyadh yesterday. The Arab world has once again shown that it is responding to occupation with demands for freedom, to annexation, to extremism with moderation, to war with initiatives for peace. The position adopted by the Arab world offers, despite the bloodshed, should be seized, not ignored. The alternative is what we see today. It requires courage, a clear vision, and a strong will to change this reality. And given the stakes, it is worth it. We stand ready to work with all of those who wish to put an immediate end to this war and to the full-fledged assault against the Palestinian people. All those who want to see an end of the Israeli occupation and conflict, to allow the Middle East to unleash its true potential for the benefit of all states and all peoples of the region and the world. But it all starts with stopping the bleeding in Gaza. Enough bloodshed, enough suffering, enough horrors. Save lives now, or we will all have to live with the terrifying consequences. Thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. For over 400 days, those who wish to see Israel villainized, demonized, and isolated have been slinging mud against the wall, hoping something will stick. Today's report from the IPC is the latest handful thrown against the wall. It is a true masterclass in misinformation, bias, and dishonest reporting. So if you take even a moment to examine its claims rationally, that mud slides down to the floor, exposing the emptiness and libel hidden beneath. It is an exercise in slander, disguised as humanitarian concern. The IPC's latest report echoes one of the most unfounded, slanderous accusations against the State of Israel throughout this conflict. Just a few hours ago, 2 Israeli civilians were murdered by Hezbollah in their latest missile attack after having fired 15,000 missiles at Israel since October 8. Yet, we will not be debating nor condemning that murderous terror regime. No, we must discuss a baseless report. Allow me to address all of the IPC's primary libels directly and then lay out the facts. First, the IPC claims a famine is imminent in northern Gaza. That is simply false. Since early October, Israel has facilitated the entry of over 713 trucks of aid to northern Gaza alone, with the goal of sustaining a steady flow of 50 trucks daily. We have delivered essential food, water, and medical supplies to areas such as Beit Lahia and Jabalia in northern Gaza, where around 10,000 civilians remain. Across Gaza, 12 bakeries are operational, producing massive quantities of bread for the population. The IPC's claim of famine has no basis in reality. Its only basis is in political bias. Ironically, the IPC's own figures show that the situation in Gaza, including in the north, is more stable now than it was before October. How could they claim a famine is imminent while at the same time providing figures of an improving situation? Second, the IPC asserts that humanitarian access in Gaza is insufficient. Once again, this is blatantly incorrect. Israel has established multiple access points to facilitate the flow of aid, with dozens of trucks entering Gaza daily through various crossings. Alone, the Erez East and Erez West crossing in the north support 600 trucks weekly. Aid also enters through routes coordinated with Egypt and Jordan, as well as via the maritime route through the Ashdod port, where over 2,000 pallets of aid arrived from the UAE just last week. This morning, the Kisufim crossing reopened in center Gaza. This checkpoint was closed in 2005. It was reopened this morning with new inspection facilities and roads to ensure safe passage. Are these the actions of a state wishing to cause a famine? Are these the actions of a state wishing for death and suffering? Or are these the actions of a nation committed to safeguarding a civilian population exploited as human shields by murderous terrorists? Third, the IPC claims that Gaza's food distribution infrastructure is failing. Israel has been proactive in supporting Gaza's food supply chain. With 3 million pita loaves produced daily, we have ensured stable access to bread for the population. Additionally, 6 tankers of cooking gas have recently entered Gaza to sustain essential infrastructure. These initiatives support a robust and consistent food aid network, not the failing system the IPC report claims. Fourth, the IPC suggests that medical facilities are collapsing due to a lack of supplies. This could not be further from the truth. Over the past few weeks alone, Israel has coordinated the entry of over 50,000 liters of fuel, 180 units of blood, and hundreds of medical supply boxes to northern Gaza's hospitals. More than 200 patients were evacuated to hospitals in the south, with support from the WHO. Fifth, the IPC claims humanitarian agencies are obstructed. In reality, the primary cause of aid delays lays in logistical issues on the Gazan side. Over 900 trucks currently sit at the Kerem Shalom crossing, packed with aid and awaiting collection by international humanitarian agencies. Some of these trucks have been sitting in empty lot for weeks as the aid rots away. We are not blocking that. That's already in Gaza. Meanwhile, Israel has proactively assisted by enhancing passage for the aid trucks, extending operating hours, and creating alternative routes to expand distribution pathways. The logistical delay is not Israel's doing. It is a failure of others to take responsibility. The report also ignores the critical role of Hamas in obstructing these agencies. I haven't heard a word from all the people who briefed us about Hamas during those briefings, hijacking trucks and stealing the aid for their own use. Finally, the IPC report outrageously questions Israel's commitment to humanitarian aid. Esteemed colleagues, our actions speak for themselves. Israel holds daily meetings with UN agencies to ensure that humanitarian needs are met despite constant security threats from terrorists. Just yesterday, we again expanded the humanitarian zone in the El Mouassi area with more field hospitals, shelter, along with greater provision of food, water, medicine, and medical equipment. We have worked through logistical obstacles, improved infrastructure, and prioritized the welfare of Gaza's civilians, even while under threat from Hamas exploiting those same civilians as cover for their murderous aims. Madam President, the IPC report is neither unbiased nor impartial. It relies on sources with a clear agenda to demonize and delegitimize Israel. Their sources include Al Jazeera, hardly known for their objectivity in covering Israel. For their previous two reports, both of which were proven false, Israel published detailed responses. We never heard back from the IPC on any of our concerns. But when you look back at those two reports, at least those reports named all of their sources. This latest one fails to even disclose the organizations which made up the analysis. From where they took that data? They should tell you that. Council members, the Council's priorities remain twisted and distorted. While we debate the report of an organization that has tragically robbed itself of any and all credibility, we avoid the real issues at hand. While we discuss a hypothetical situation that will not come to pass, we ignore the 900 trucks collecting dust in a lot in Gaza waiting to be distributed by UN agencies. While we examine the words of prejudiced organizations making absurd accusations, we fail to examine the role of Hamas in hijacking aid, which they reroute into their machine of death and misery. Hamas has hijacked aid trucks, diverted resources, and used civilians as cover for its terror activities. Every truck diverted by Hamas means fewer resources for innocent people. Yet, how much time does this council dedicate to that reality? In recent days, we have gathered and released mountains of evidence on the discontent and anger among the Gazan population directed at Hamas. I don't know, Mr. Mansour, when was the last time you visited Gaza, or you slept in Gaza, or you met someone from Gaza, but we can show you footage what the people of Gaza really think about Hamas. Video of mothers screaming that Hamas took their sons, men crying out that it is Hamas who is to blame for their suffering. We have also released video footage of Hamas terrorists torturing Gazan civilians, violating all concepts of human rights and morality. While the Council discussed a report based on the word of Al Jazeera and unnamed organizations, the people of Gaza themselves are telling you what must be done to resolve the situation. They are crying out to you, listen to them. Get out of your own way, because we simply cannot continue in this manner. This obsession with vilifying Israel is detached from reality. Let us only examine the facts at hand instead of the political agendas that have plagued our debates for so long. Before leaving the chamber today, I urge each of you to consider the facts. Look closely at Israel's actions on the ground. Consider the risks our soldiers take to uphold these humanitarian commitments, often in the face of active threats. Recognize that while the IPC might sling mud, Israel is working persistently at great personal cost to deliver aid and uphold the principles of international law. Acknowledge that Hamas is the source of the situation. Follow the cries of the Gazan people and focus your energy on defeating their true oppressors, the Hamas terrorists. As we have seen before, there are agencies whose focus is bashing Israel, and there are agencies dedicated to real humanitarian work. This Council has a responsibility to make that distinction and focus on enhancing those agencies committed to genuine aid, not those invested in spreading lies. Ultimately, Israel will continue its work to protect civilian lives and fulfill humanitarian obligations despite biased reports and manipulated narratives. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you, Madam President.
يشرفني أن ألقي هذا البيان نيابة عن المجموعة العربية. بداية تتقدم المجموعة العربية بالشكر من كل من الجزائر،
Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia, and Switzerland
على طلبهم لعقد هذا
for
الاجتماع
calling for
الهام
this important meeting
خطر
to discuss
المجاعة
the risk of
في شمال
famine
غزة.
in northern Gaza.
وذلك عقب صدور تقرير
Following
لجنة
the
مراجعة
report
المجاعة
by the
التابعة
IPC's Famine
للتصنيف
Review
المتكامل
Committee
لمراحل الأمن
on food
الغذائي يوم
security
الجمعة الفائت.
issued last Friday.
كما أشكر مقدمي
I would also
الإحاطات جميعا
like to
على
thank all the
إحاطاتهم
briefers
القيمة.
for their valuable briefings.
السيدة الرئيسة،
Madam President,
دق التقرير
the
ناقوس
report
الخطر
sounded the alarm
وأعلنها
bells
بكل وضوح.
and said it clearly.
هناك احتمال وشيك
There is a
وكبير
strong
بحدوث
likelihood
مجاعة
that famine is
بسبب
imminent
التدهور
because of the
السريع
rapid
للوضع
deterioration
في
of
قطاع
the
غزة.
situation in the Gaza Strip.
وأضاف التقرير
The
أنه
report
قد
added
يكون قد تم تجاوز
that
عتبات
the
المجاعة
famine
بالفعل
threshold has
أو
been
أنه
crossed
سيتم
or could be
تجاوزها
crossed
في القريب
very
العاجل.
soon.
ودعت اللجنة في تقريرها
In its
إلى
report,
اتخاذ
the
إجراءات
committee
فورية
called for
خلال
taking
أيام وليس
immediate
أسابيع
measures within
من
days,
قبل جميع
not
الجهات
weeks,
الفاعلة
by all
لتجنب
relevant
وتخفيف
parties
هذا الوضع
to avert
الكارثي.
and alleviate this catastrophic
السيدة الرئيسة،
situation. Madam President,
حدث ما حذرنا
what we
منه
have warned
طيلة
against
الشهور
for
الماضية،
months has
ووصلنا
happened.
إلى وضع
The
لا يمكن
situation
وصفه
today
إلا
can only be
بالمأساوي.
described as tragic.
وبتنا الآن في سباق
We
مع
are
الزمن،
now at a race
ولا
in a
يمكن
race with
الانتظار
time.
أكثر للتحرك.
We can no longer wait to take
فيجب على
action.
المجلس
The
التدخل
Security
الآن
Council must
واتخاذ
interfere
تدابير
now
فورية
and take
لمنع وقوع
immediate
هذه
action
الكارثة.
to avert this
فمن غير
catastrophe.
المسموح أن يتفرج العالم
It
أجمع
is
على شعب
unacceptable for the
إن
entire
نجا
world
من
to
الإبادة
stand and
الإسرائيلية
watch an entire
سيموت من
people
الجوع في الأيام القليلة المقبلة.
that, if they survive the
عند
Israeli
مصداقية
genocide,
مجلسكم
will die
اليوم
of
على
hunger
المحك.
in the next few days. The
من هنا
credibility of your council
نجدد
today
دعوة
is at stake.
لمجلسكم
Once
الكريم
again, we call
بإيقاف
upon your
حرب
august
الإبادة فورا
council to stop the
ووقف إطلاق
genocidal
النار
war
الفوري وغير
immediately
المشروط
and ensure an
وإنهاء
unconditional and
الكارثة
immediate
الإنسانية الغير
ceasefire
مسبوقة
to end the
ورفع كل
unprecedented
القيود والعوائق
humanitarian
أمام
catastrophe,
النفاذ
to lift
الإنساني
all
الآمن
restrictions
والسريع
impeding the
وغير
safe,
المشروط إلى
rapid, and
القطاع
unconditional
ورفض تهجير
humanitarian
المواطنين
access, and to
الفلسطينيين
reject the
داخل
displacement
أرضهم
of
أو إلى
Palestinian
خارجها.
citizens in Palestine and
كما ندعو
outside.
مجلسكم الكريم
We also call
بإدانة
upon your
سياسة
august
العقاب
council
الجماعي
to condemn the
التي
policy of
تنتهجها
collective punishment
إسرائيل
adopted by
واستخدامها
Israel
الحصار
and its use
والتجويع
of the blockade
سلاحا
and
ضد
starvation
المدنيين
as
في قطاع
weapons
غزة.
against civilians in the Gaza
السيدة
Strip.
الرئيسة،
Madam President,
نلتقي اليوم
we meet
بعد
today,
يوم على انعقاد
one day
القمة العربية
after the
الإسلامية في الرياض
Arab-Islamic
في
Summit in
المملكة العربية
Riyadh in the
السعودية
Kingdom of
الشقيقة
Saudi Arabia,
برئاسة صاحب السمو الملكي
presided over
الأمير
by
محمد
His
بن
Royal
سلمان بن
Highness
عبد
Prince
العزيز
Mohammed
السعود،
bin Salman bin
حيث
Abd
أكدت
al-Aziz
الدول
Al
العربية
Saud.
والإسلامية
Muslim
على
and
مركزية
Arab
القضية
states
الفلسطينية
stress the
وعلى دعمها
centrality of the
الراسخ
Palestinian
للشعب
cause
الفلسطيني
and stress their
لنيل
firm
حقوقه
support to
الوطنية
the
المشروعة
Palestinian people
غير
to
القابلة
enjoy their
للتصرف.
legitimate, inalienable national
وقد
rights.
نتج عن القمة
The summit
جملة
adopted
مقررات
a number
سيتم
of
تنفيذها
decisions that will be
للتصدي للعدوان
implemented to fight
الإسرائيلي
the Israeli
على قطاع
aggression
غزة
on the
ولبنان.
Gaza Strip and Lebanon.
وإذ نتطلع إلى
As we
المؤتمر
look
الإنساني
forward to the
الذي
humanitarian
ستستضيفه
conference,
القاهرة
which will be held
في
in
الثاني من كانون
Cairo
الأول
on December
2024
2nd,
في سياق
2024,
جهود
as
توفير
part of
الدعم
the
الإنساني
efforts
الكافي
to
للقطاع.
provide
نعيد
sufficient
تأكيدنا
humanitarian
على
support
دعم
to the
الجهود الكبيرة
Gaza Strip.
والمقدرة
We
التي
reaffirm our
بذلتها
support
كل من
to the tremendous
جمهورية مصر
appreciated
العربية
efforts
ودولة
made
قطر
by Egypt
بالتعاون مع
and the
الولايات
state of
المتحدة
Qatar in
الأمريكية
cooperation with the United
لإنجاز
States of
وقف
America
فوري
to
ودائم
reach an
لإطلاق
immediate
النار في
and
قطاع غزة.
lasting ceasefire in the
ونحمل
Gaza
إسرائيل
Strip. We
مسؤولية
hold
فشل هذه
Israel
الجهود نتيجة
responsible for the
تراجع الحكومة
failure of the
الإسرائيلية عن الاتفاقات التي كان توصل إليها المفاوضون. السيدة الرئيسة،
Madam President, at a time when the humanitarian crisis gets worse and famine is threatening the Gaza Strip, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating, and the number of food insecure people in Syria and Lebanon is on the rise, especially among the displaced, who are now estimated at more than 1.2 million. The Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Mr. Michael Fakhri, warned against the repetition of the scenario of starving Palestinians in Lebanon, noting that Israel can starve Lebanon the same way it starved Palestinians in Gaza. He warned against a great risk, namely a rapid increase in hunger and malnutrition rates in Lebanon. In this vein, I call upon international donors to respond to the urgent call by the United Nations and its agencies to fund humanitarian and relief work. Madam President, 1 year after the start of the genocidal war against the Palestinian people, after the continuing Israeli aggression on Lebanon and Syria, after the adoption of 4 resolutions of the Security Council, Israel continues its crimes and its intransigence in complete and utter disregard of the UN Charter, the principles of international law, the international humanitarian law, and all resolutions of international legitimacy, including the resolutions of the Security Council. Until when will you allow your resolutions to remain dead letter? Until when will you allow Israel to continue violating all humanitarian and legal principles? Until when will you allow Israel to enjoy impunity for its crimes? Madam President, all eyes are on you. It is time to take action. It is either now or never. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Lebanon for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
I'm as helpless as a kitten up a tree. And I feel like I'm clinging to a cloud. I can't understand. I get misty just holding your hand. Walk my way. And a million violins begin to play. Or it might be the sound of your hello, hello. The music I hear, I get misty. The moment you're near, you can say, you can say that you're leading me on. Well, it's just what I want you to do, just what I want you to do. Don't you notice how hopelessly I'm lost? That's why I'm following you. On my own, on my own. Would I wander through this wonderland alone? Never knowing my right foot from my left, my hat from my glove. I'm too misty and too much in love, too much in love. I'm too misty, too misty, too misty, and too much in love.
Radio Swiss Jazz. Music pure. Channel 1. 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 Channel 1.